Good evening, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us on a Friday evening, late afternoon, depending on where you are. Um, we're Project Wellness, which is a mental health magazine created by students for students, and we're really excited to host our first guest speaker series. And thank you, Dr. Stephen Barnes, for joining us today. We're all really excited to have you here, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward to your answers to the questions that we have.
Mhm,
But we received quite a few questions through the Google form, which is great.
mhm,
Thank you to everybody who submitted those, but unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them
mhm.
just because we have limited time and we're going to be focusing on Stephen's field of expertise. So yeah, as a heads up, today's session is going to be recorded and then it'll be posted online via YouTube or in a podcast format. We'll see. But yeah, today we'll follow a Q&A format. Everyone here can ask questions to Stephen at any point in time in the chat, and Stephen is going to answer them.
Yep.
In terms of schedule, we're going to start with questions that people have about students' experience, work, student mental health, and around like 7:35 EST, which is 4:35 PST, we're going to switch to questions about graduate school research and whatnot. And we'll finish at around 8 EST.
Okay.
So yeah, to start off, thank you again for joining us. Stephen, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with student mental health?
Sure. Yeah. Um, so I was a student at the University of British Columbia, where I'm now currently faculty. I did my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and my PhD here. Went away for a while, did other things, but then came back and was hired as a faculty member. I'm in the Department of Psychology here at UBC. And I've been involved in a number of different sort of fields over the years. I actually started off in epilepsy research, both human and some mostly animal work, but some human work as well. And then I branched out and I started doing interactive installation artwork. I did a postdoc in that, so went very different field. And then I came back and realized over time that I just like teaching. So my position, which is fairly unique to UBC, although there's comparable positions elsewhere in Canada, I'm professor of teaching at UBC. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's really
in
amazing.
terms of my experience related to student mental health, I don't do that too much these days specifically, but it was a big area for me when I started here as faculty. Nowadays, I do mostly research related to bipolar disorder, but I also do a lot of learning technology research as well. Yeah.
Really cool. Could
Mhm.
you elaborate a little bit about the stuff that you did related to student mental health in those a while
Sure.
ago?
Yeah, so the what we did, a large group of us, both students, faculty, and staff at UBC, we basically followed something called the Okanagan Charter, which was something that was written by a large group of university administrators and faculty and students. I don't know the exact year. I think it was about 2012, which basically was a call to action to deal with student mental health crisis on campuses across Canada and obviously elsewhere as well. So what we did is we set about trying to do an assessment first off of what the situation was at UBC in terms of student mental health, and then next, after having accomplished that, what could we do to, help boost their mental health? And we've developed like toolkits for instructors, toolkits for administrators, and these are all available online, free to access. Just advice to instructors, like what small changes can you do to help boost the mental health of your students, and what big changes can you do if you are so inclined? Yeah.
Really interesting. That sounds like a great resource too.
Yeah.
And the next question that we have is related to student mental health
Mhm.
in general, but it's a little bit of a shift. It's about your thoughts on the debate of over medicalization of mental illness.
Yeah, and this is a long-standing debate, and it certainly doesn't, I mean, it dates back literally to the birth of psychiatry. Um, And the conceptualizing of what used to be called madness as something you would treat is actually, it's not that old. It's only a couple centuries old. So from its outset, it was always a matter of debate, and it still is a matter of debate. Although you see it less in public discourse and more in really in people's heads. As someone who lives with a mental illness, I do. Um, I it's a constant debate. It's been a constant debate for me since the time of my first diagnosis back as an undergraduate student. Do I take medications? Do I seek treatment? Or am I just different? And is it okay to just be different? I don't think there's a hard right or wrong answer here, and it really, in my mind, is a function of the nature of the type of mental health struggle that a person is dealing with. Um, there are some conditions that it's debatable. It's highly debatable whether it's worthwhile seeking treatment. Um, and there's others that I would argue are probably best dealt with in medical settings. Doesn't have to be Western medicine necessarily, but seeking support is going to be critical. And the conditions, like off the top of my head, that I'm thinking of are conditions that involve psychosis. So bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Um, Initially, when the person is in psychosis, they're going to need support. And often, sadly, they won't want support. In fact, many of them will not even, accept the idea of going to a doctor for what they're dealing with. So it's a very tricky situation. And yeah, it's contentious as well because it can involve hospitalizing someone without their consent, potentially. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Would you be open on elaborating on that, like related to bipolar disorder? Or
Oh, as to why bipolar disorder should be treated medically?
or more so just, well, whatever, I guess, whatever
Yeah.
you are most comfortable with related to
Yeah.
bipolar disorder.
Yeah. So I'll just say that it's fine initially to have something be treated as a medical condition. It doesn't mean that it has to forever. And there is this sort of dominant thought about schizophrenia, about bipolar disorder, that people never recover from this and that this is a lifelong condition. But there are people who recover, but you don't hear about them. And in part, it's because they are kept on medications and they don't with their doctor sit down and say, do I still need this level of dose or this number of medications? It's a very, very difficult thing to navigate, in part because psychiatric conditions psychiatric medications can be very difficult to remove. Many of them have withdrawal symptoms that are comparable to some classically addictive drugs, right? Um, yeah, I don't know if that addresses your follow-up question, but feel free to ask again if I didn't. Yeah.
I think it does. I think, yeah, it's a pretty tricky debate, and it's interesting to hear about your like personal
Yeah.
experience involving
I,
bipolar
I
disorder.
would just say that it's not a cut and dry. There's no cut and dry answer here. And I think it should be debated not at the level of this massive thing known as mental illness and mental health, but rather at the level of what a person is dealing with. And it's a personal debate too, that one must have and not necessarily accept advice that you need to seek medical treatment. You should be one of the deciders of that.
Because experience like varies person to
It
person.
does. It
Yeah.
does. I mean, ultimately, every psychiatric condition is diagnosed verbally. Um, you have to speak to the person in most cases, and that involves speaking to the person. And just to say that person needs medication without speaking to them is problematic.
Right. Yeah. And on the, I guess, on the topic of personal experience, the next question that we have is decently personal to a specific person. It's a question from a recently graduated graduate student identifying as neurodivergent who's asking about how graduate school was really difficult on their mental health.
Right.
And they feel like even after graduating, they're still recovering from anxiety and many years of not taking care of their mental health. Do you
Yeah.
have any recommendations for how students or former students can work on building back better mental health after graduate school?
Yeah. I mean, being a student is hard, and it's actually I would editorialize that it's harder for students these days than it was for me in the 90s and late 90s. And early 2000s. The reason is actually related in my mind. My personal theory is that it all boils down to PowerPoint, but that's a separate discussion. What I will say is that it can be very tricky as a graduate student and an undergraduate student to sort of maintain pastimes, exercise. You get crunched. You get crunched with exams, you get crunched with deadlines, and they're constantly coming. Now, the other aspect of it is both, especially these days, are very, very competitive. And there is often the perception, right or wrong, that you are in competition with your peers for some golden egg. But it doesn't have to be that way. And you need to decide for yourself whether this is worth it. And I speak especially to people who might have a history of mental illness in their family. Because yes, people talk about marijuana causing mental illness, and yes, people talk about other things causing mental illness, but ultimately, the most reliable trigger of mental illness is stress and chronic stress. And that is what grad school can entail. Now, unless you're very good at sort of putting brakes on yourself and your ambitions, most people are not in my experience. I'm certainly not. Sorry, I didn't mean to give a thumbs up. I will say that I think if you can at least have some sort of system to even dedicate 15 minutes a day to some activity, and I'm not just talking exercise, I'm talking, it could be art. My new ritual for the last 5 years, it's, that's a long time. Doesn't sound new, but it's newish for me. Is to dedicate at least a minimum of 1 hour a day to fiddling in my art studio out in my garage. And for better or for worse, even if I just do a dab of paint, the act of just doing that ritual, I think has benefited me remarkably over the years. Yeah. But I abandoned that. I abandoned that artistic practice shortly into my undergraduate degree, and really my mental health and during my undergraduate and graduate degrees was terrible. As I said, I got diagnosed with depression, and I didn't do anything about it because I was, in a sense, handed pills, and I was hopeful that the pills would help me on their own. That's rarely the case, that sort of self-help is going to end at taking a drug. Even people who are taking medications for, let's say, schizophrenia, yes, they do not believe that the voices that they're hearing are real, that is, real entities outside of them, but they're still there. And that's stressful, and it needs to be managed somehow too. And that sort of leads into what I do now mostly, which is I work on bipolar disorder research, but most of it is focused on self-management strategies. And if you look at this literature, it is broadly applicable to most forms of mental health and mental illness. And even people who are mentally well can benefit from a lot of these techniques. And there's so many that have been documented. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
In terms of like these these help strategies,
Yeah.
are you able to elaborate a little bit about them?
Oh, there's so many examples. I mean, it can be as seemingly obvious as getting enough sleep, to having like a ritual that is rewarding to you. Now, when I say ritual that is rewarding to you, taking an addictive drug every day is not necessarily what you want to do, but doing something that will benefit your health, get you exercise, free your mind from what you're doing on a day-to-day basis from a work or school standpoint is usually going to be a benefit to you. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Related to that, yeah, somebody says it's really interesting to hear like your take on graduate school and mental health. And if you could talk a little bit about your like personal experience and what did you find that helped you the most?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So, as I sort of alluded there, I was struggling quite a bit during my graduate studies. And ultimately, what ended up, towards the end of my PhD degree, I really struggled through my master's and early part of my PhD. I had to create a boundary for myself between my graduate work and my life. And with school, it gets very blurry, always gets very blurry, that boundary. And that's in part of the nature of school. Like you go to classes, you go into this campus, you attend classes, but then you do homework. And homework by definition is something you do outside of school in most cases. So it can be very tricky to navigate and to set those boundaries. It's easier as a graduate student, I would argue, than it is as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, you have this flurry of courses, whereas a graduate student, you have to like set your own goals. You have to decide on what your research is, where it's going, what you want to accomplish with it. And you just have to set those boundaries and realize that it depends on the nature of the graduate studies. But like for example, I went through a science, I'm trained as a neuroscientist. Um, my training was focused on acquiring data and doing research. And sometimes doing more and more of it is not necessarily going to accomplish what you hope it will accomplish. Science is fickle in the sense that, yes, you could have the best hypothesis. Yes, you could have the best methodology. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work out and you'll have something that you can publish at the end of your degree. And that can be an unattainable goal for some. And it's not at all related to their skill or how smart they are or anything. That's science. If everyone knew they were going to get positive results, why would you even do the study, right?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And it kind of
So
sounds like a challenge.
yeah, it is well, and that can be hard too. Like the practice of science is, in a sense, a little bit punishing. You will not always get the results that you were hoping to get, and that's if you think of that as a learning opportunity, which it is, and that's what it is in science, then it's helpful to reframe it a lot. Yeah. Going back to the sort of larger question about graduate studies in general and how you can find wellness in the course of your graduate studies. I will again say that um, really having a habit or a skill or a talent that you are constantly coming back to and exploring that is outside of what you do on a day-to-day basis as part of your graduate degree is going to be really beneficial, even if it's like 15 minutes a day and it involves walking down the street. Because graduate studies, again, it depends on the field, can be very time intensive in terms of sitting down in one spot and writing. And that can take its toll in and of itself, right?
Right. Yeah. And for you, that was your artwork.
It was my artwork at the time. It was also my video games that I played, but a bit of both. Yeah,
Right.
I had a great interest outside of my neuroscience research at the time, which was computer programming and game creation. So that was like something I did on the side.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's just something I enjoyed.
Oh,
Mhm.
nice. In terms of, I guess I know you brought up your artwork a couple of times now. It kind of leads into a question that we did have about people who are really curious about your artwork, and if you could tell us a bit more about it, or even show us if you'd be willing to, and also how it relates to mental health or your mental health, if you'd be willing to
Yeah.
share.
Yeah, so I've kind of explored a number of different areas, ranging from like installation artwork that is more theory driven to things that are more personal. These days, I often work a lot in oil paints, which has its own challenges. I don't recommend it to someone who doesn't have good ventilation wherever they're working, or a nice open window. But I find it very enjoyable. I find it very, I don't know. I like it better than acrylics. I've painted it with acrylics many times. My topically, like what are the subjects of my paintings? I never use reference images. It's all straight off the top of my head. And it's usually the drawing for it is done on the canvas in less than a couple of minutes. So I have this like feeling for myself that I need to get a form out, and I don't know what that form is going to be. I don't predetermine it. This is like something I'm still working on. It's an ongoing process to like separate yourself from the intent to produce something and determining and hoping that the outcome is exactly what you did in your sketch. my goal is to put that form out there and then explore it on the canvas. It also saves a lot of time and prep. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Mhm.
And then what are some of the like topics that you explore in your artwork or themes?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, a lot of it's not predetermined. I'm just finishing off the third painting of a set of three, and that set of three is about psychiatric treatments in the 1950s and 1960s. So what I've done is I basically have taken old ads from biomedical journals, some of them, like by today's standards, very offensive. Or, I have an ad for lobotomy. I have an ad for Thorazine, which is a psychiatric medication that is not used so frequently anymore, but was ubiquitous in the day, and also one for electroconvulsive shock. The series, which I haven't put on my website yet, but as I said, I'm just wrapping up the third one, is called The Lesser of Three Evils. And what it is, it's each painting is like a stained glass. It looks like stained glass. And yeah, it's basically just a recreation of these ads, but I don't know what the right word to say is. It looks like stained glass. I mean, in stained glass, if you think about it, is very commonly seen in settings where the, the subject that is in the stained glass is revered and is sort of held up as it might be in churches, it might be of apostles, it might be of all sorts of things, it might be a government figure, who knows? Um, and so I want to situate those people that are getting that treatment, which arguably is not very good treatment, um, as the heroes. So yeah, that was sort of the idea behind it. Yeah.
Sounds really interesting.
As an
And
example. Yeah.
I looking forward to see that when
Mhm.
when it's completed.
Yeah.
But yeah, the second part of that question, like asked about how it relates to mental health. I'm not sure if you would like to elaborate on that or if
How that relates to mental health?
or
Uh,
just your artwork in general, if you have any specific pieces in mind.
yeah, I mean that was a good example in the
Right,
sense
yeah.
it's clearly related. A lot of my other stuff is very it's not predetermined, so I usually don't even know what the topic is until I see the end product. And it is largely personal. It is imagery that comes to me. It is memories that come to me, and it is a process of self-discovery. That's how I see it. Yeah. And that's important too. I mean, that kind of period, like that time for reflection. Like, I don't know if it's the painting act itself or it's the time for reflection and what psychologists and other people call flow. That is the feeling that you have become lost in what you're doing, and that time doesn't make any difference anymore. Flow, people achieve flow in various sort of pastimes that they have in their life, but flow is therapeutic. Yeah.
And I know a little bit of a shift in topic. I know we had some people who asked this in a more specific sense, but if you had more advice in a more general sense about getting into the field of neuroscience, or
Yeah.
maybe even your experience with like what made you want to go into the field of neuroscience and how did you get into this field?
Sure. So this will go way back to my undergraduate degree. And I don't know, I feel like I might have told you this story at one point, Melody. I'm not sure why. But I will say that I did a first year science degree, first year of a science degree, and I wasn't very happy with it. And by fluke, I decided after my first year, I had to choose a major at that time, that I would choose something and in my mind, that was as least sciencey as possible. And so I went through like the course calendar. You didn't have a website back when I went to school. And I found this major that said psychology. And it was a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. And I was like, okay, that doesn't seem like anything else that I didn't enjoy in first year. And so I enrolled in that major. And I was sold like within the first few weeks because the person who taught that course was such an amazing teacher and relayed every piece of information in the context of some larger story and narrative, that it just became very appealing to me. And it turned out he wasn't the only one who had that approach to teaching. Many of the people who were in the Department of Psychology here at UBC took that approach. They wanted to tell in terms of stories and situate things historically and contextually. Yeah. And so that was a very different take on science for me, looking at sort of the history of science, trends in science, even the business of science, as some people call it. That was very refreshing. It was more philosophical in a way. Yeah. Yeah. And so that was, despite it being called psychology, that field that I was studying later became known as behavioral neuroscience. And in fact, it mutated in its terms. It was that degree was called psychology, then it was called biopsychology, then it was called behavioral neuroscience. Um, and yeah, I mean, neuroscience is a huge field. And to think that you need to go necessarily into a program that's labeled neuroscience, you don't need to. There's lots of fields, zoology, there's neuroscientists in zoology, there's neuroscientists in psychology, philosophy, lots of different areas. If you come at it as it's such a broad field that you have to sort of think about what interests me, and not only what interests me, but two, what do I enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis? Do I like contemplative self-reflection? Maybe I should go into like philosophy of mind. Do I like working with humans? Maybe I should go into something that's more clinical or human-based research. It should be a mixture of what you enjoy, interpersonally, socially, and just in terms of career and interests. Um, that is sort of a key ingredient that if you are going to survive a graduate degree, I'd say a lot of people would agree with this statement that um, to go through 6 to 7 years of graduate studies, you need to be interested in what you're studying, or it can be very punishing. Yeah. Um, so if you're not sure, if you want to do that graduate degree, my personal recommendation would be to take some time off. Honestly, it's not going to hurt you. I, I I know that when I was younger, I felt like I needed to finish my degree in 4 years. I needed to get my master's done in 2 years. I needed to get my PhD done in 4 years, as if there was some race and I was racing against someone else. Once you're in graduate studies, you're not racing against anyone else except yourself and your own expectations for yourself. Yeah.
Right. That's always important to keep in mind.
Mm.
And I know we took a little bit of a shift to, I guess, graduate school and research,
Yeah.
but before we make an official, I guess, pivot to that section of our Q&A, I'll ask you the last question that we have
Sure.
related just to your own experience. But
Mhm.
if you have any helpful accommodations or recommendations for students who are living with mental illness, like
Yeah.
maybe stuff that you have tried to do or what you have found most helpful for students?
Yeah. First off, I will say that most universities now, they didn't when I was in school, have, well set up systems to manage accommodations. So do take advantage of them and don't ever feel like you're somehow bypassing things in order to use those accommodations. Those are there because you deserve them. They're not there because you have some sort of, you need a crutch. They are there because you need them and you deserve them. So don't ever think about it any other way. There's a lot of self-stigma wrapped up in seeking accommodations for a health condition that shouldn't be there. But it is, it's our society that's still adapting to that way of thinking. Um, and so use those services, use your access through your university to healthcare services. Students and certainly faculty are very privileged in terms of our ability to access like things like student health services, where you could go in and the wait time is a lot less than you would have outside of the university. If you need a psychiatrist, then go to the student health system. You're going to see one a lot faster than you'll see one if you try to just go off the street somewhere. So use those resources. Most universities have tons of them. Sadly, they're often very scattered, and it's not clear to students in many cases what is helping you with what, but just explore them and don't get daunted if you're kind of ping-ponged between different places. You will find something. The other thing, it's interesting. Many years ago, some students approached me about starting a peer-run support group. at UBC, at the University of Matt. That has been running, actually. We started it up and it's been running ever since. I'm not a part of it because it was meant to be a student-run peer support group. Peer support groups, if you can find them at your university or in your community, are a fantastic way to speak publicly about what you're dealing with without fear of threat or anyone thinking differently about you. And the sad reality is that many mental illnesses carry a lot of stigma. And the research on stigma clearly shows that the worst form of stigma is the one that you do to yourself. And you kind of are indirectly doing it to yourself. It's called self-stigma. So this is when you have stigma in an environment that might be structural, that is rules that are laid out to, in essence, stigmatize individuals who are living with a mental illness, and social stigma, where people treat you differently because you have a label. You internalize all those experiences over time, and that's punishing. And that's the worst possible sort of self-stigma, sort of stigma. And it is the most difficult thing to deal with. But the one tried and true method of dealing with self-stigma is to talk about it openly, what you're dealing with. Now, I don't recommend anyone who's living with mental illness necessarily run out and make a YouTube channel and tell the world about what it's like to live with their mental illness. There's risk associated with that. It's righteous, it's great, and it basically paves the way for other people to do the same. But there's a risk associated with that. That is, people will treat you differently. Not everyone, but some will. Yeah. And if this is a future employer, it's a professor teaching a class, everyone's subject to stigma, whether or not they're even conscious of it. So just, be cautious. I'm privileged in my situation to be able to speak about what I live with openly because I worry less about like people acting differently. They still do, but I am in a department of psychology. I am at a university, and I'm also tenured, which means no one can fire me at this point unless I do something really awful. So, it's not as threatening for me to speak about these things as it is for someone who's starting their career. Now, going back to your comment about managing a mental illness in the context of studies or graduate studies. One thing that you need to really be careful, not careful, you really need to think carefully about when you're entering grad school, because part of the process of applying to grad school is reaching out to potential supervisors. And there's always this question I get from students who have a mental illness and they're applying to grad school. Do I tell this potential supervisor that I have this diagnosis? It's a very, very difficult, I can't even answer that. And it's very difficult to know. I have had a student come back to me once, which I said, I don't know if I feel comfortable giving that advice. And they said, you know what? I just went and told them. And there was one supervisor that I approached that clearly was turned off because they never replied to my emails ever again. But there was one supervisor who kind of welcomed me in because it almost felt like because I disclosed, they welcomed me into their lab. It is a risky endeavor to do that. But if you are someone who wants to be open about your condition, it is also a litmus test in the sense that do you really, if I live with bipolar disorder, do I really want to work with someone for 6 years who is significantly biased against people who have bipolar disorder? Maybe that's a good thing to tell it right up front because you'll know right away if they're going to treat you poorly for that 6 years, right? And working in a lab and working on a PhD and master's degree, sorry, there was something flying by, is quite, it's a lot of work, and you work often very closely with other individuals, be the other graduate students, maybe postdoctoral fellows, but certainly the PI, the person who's running the lab. And to have that person treat you as a lesser individual is awful. Yeah, I know people who were in that situation going through graduate degrees.
Yeah, so it's always, It's important to put yourself first, but also
Yeah,
take into consideration the environment that you want to be in for
exactly.
your graduate.
Mhm.
Yeah, graduate studies. And I think that's um it's a nice place to end off in terms of advice relating to mental health and a nice place to pivot into, I guess, a second segment of today's Q&A, which relates more to graduate school and research and whatnot. In
Mhm.
terms of that, our first question is, well, it's actually a combination of two questions of what are the recommended steps to take or activities to participate in as an undergraduate student looking to go to graduate school, or in general, how do you make yourself a more competitive applicant?
Yeah, I'm going to tie this in a bit to what we just talked about a little while ago, which was, you asked me, there was a question about advice for, maintaining good mental health in while you're dealing with a graduate or undergraduate degree. A lot of students believe, mistakenly, I would argue, that potential supervisors for graduate studies are only interested in what they do in their discipline and nothing else. So students, I found, feel compelled to go only for super high grades and fight for that 0.5% difference versus having other activities, hobbies, interests, sports outside of university. A lot of graduate supervisors, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of graduate supervisors like to see that. And it's because they often know that people who make their way well through graduate studies are often balancing their mental health and prioritizing it at least a bit because it's a marathon. It's a 6-year marathon. Well, it depends on the degree, but 4 to 6 year marathon. And they like to see people also that are well-rounded because well-rounded people have creative ideas oftenly because they're bringing in different perspectives and stuff. Whereas if all you do is really study, that one subfield of psychology or neuroscience and nothing else, it's not necessarily going to be of that much interest to a potential supervisor. So don't like throw everything out because you feel like a supervisor who happens to be in a department of psychology is only interested in psychology. They're not. They have their own things that they do, right? And they're always interested to see what other people are doing. It's also a great conversation starter. And ultimately, that's a big part of finding how to get into graduate school. It's building relationships with potential supervisors. I would never, if it's in your power financially, to go to a potential school to meet the potential supervisor that you're thinking of working with, I would invest in that money if it's within your reach. It is a long-term commitment and it doesn't just end at you graduating. It obviously has ramifications for the rest of your career, what you do, right? So invest in that because it's important you work under someone who's invested in you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Especially because like graduate school as a whole is decently different from
Yeah,
undergraduate.
it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
It's
So
less
yeah, I
so
mean,
applying.
maintain that well-roundedness. It's good for you, and it's also good for your career. People just don't realize that. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Especially because there's a lot of skills that are as important for being in graduate school or doing research or whatnot, such as I'm guessing creativity.
yeah. Creative thinking is critical for any field that you would study in graduate studies. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask, as related to that,
Mhm.
um, what other skills, I guess, are important to maybe develop when you're in your undergrad if you're considering graduate school,
Mhm.
and how to develop those skills?
Public speaking, without a doubt. I walked into my graduate studies not having a single ounce of public speaking. I somehow managed to avoid doing any public speaking during my undergraduate. Sorry. Um, but yeah, that's very, very useful to have. Some people I know who were really adept in graduate studies, were students who were actually in drama, that they took drama classes, or I knew one person really well who was an excellent public speaker, and he took all these stand-up comedy classes. And it's remarkable what that little kind of hobby on the side, how it can benefit you in terms of public speaking. Makes you more engaging, right? Makes you sort of explain things clearly as well, and speak and enunciate like clearly to your audience, and know how to treat and interact with an audience too. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
one little thing that is worth a little investment, like a little night class in stand-up comedy. Why not? It could be fun too. What other skills? Um, I mean, I think, one major part of graduate studies, I don't know if I can say this for any field, but being critical of what you read, just don't like, there's not much value in just sitting and reading something and not sort of trying to not tear it apart, but tease it apart and see where the issues are and where the strengths are. That's something you'll have to do is the day you walk into most graduate programs. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Two off the top of my head. I mean, there's lots of things that can prepare you. And I think going back to, what I said about, sort of diversifying your experience, that's of great benefit too, because you bring a unique flavor to the graduate program as well. Right?
mhm, yeah. And I guess in terms, I guess, related to bringing unique flavor in terms of, I guess, both finding a supervisor and getting into graduate school and also succeeding in graduate school, how do you, if everybody's developing these skills and getting these grades and doing these things,
Yeah.
how do you make yourself stand out? Just being personable or?
Yeah, I mean, I think having cool little hobbies is always a good little conversation starter. I'm not saying go out and start skydiving unless you really want to. But conversation starters. And if you can, um, it is awkward because often people are applying to different cities and it's difficult to like reach out to professors because often it'll come down to emails. And emails they're hit and miss. You're not going to have the kind of success rate you would have if you just walked up to someone or knocked on their office door. But that's not always possible. If you have the opportunity to speak to them in person, don't write an email. I mean, the logic is quite, I think it's, I think it's straightforward in the sense that most people will have a lot of difficulty saying no to someone to their face. Especially professors, we tend to be a fairly timid bunch. But emails, given the volume of email most of us get on a daily basis, even if we're not intending to ignore your email, we just might not see it. Yeah. And then what I will also add to that is that never, ever take a lack of a reply to an email as anything personal or saying anything about you. You have to think about all the potential reasons why a person might not be replying to an email. It could be that they're on leave, could be they're in the hospital, could be that they're dealing with a loved one who's sick. There's so many possible reasons as to why a professor might not reply to you. They have a life too. And just, I mean, just be conscious of that, not in respect of them, but just in respect of yourself. That is, you don't want to punish yourself over these things. You will never know the reason why they didn't reply. And there's no point in spending any time and effort to wonder. Sure, send them a one follow-up email. Maybe maybe just slid down their inbox, and you get better luck the next time. I've been sort of, I think I've already told you this in some context, Melody, but I've been had this realization out of my own life recently that I always check I know a lot of my colleagues do too. I always check my email in the morning. I don't know why. I don't know. That's when I answer most of my emails is like when I get up at 5. Yes, I get up at 5. Um, so my suggestion as one strategy is to send your email the night before, especially the night before, like a Monday, and hit send delay to like 4 a.m. Because why? It'll be the first thing they see when they open their email app in the morning. Uh, Often I am just working down as far as I can down the list on a daily basis. So it's your email will be more visible. Develop a CV. I mean, the CV is the language of the academic. And for better or for worse, we're pretty poor at reading resumes and reading between the lines. We know CVs inside and out. So most universities, colleges will have some sort of student support system workshops that will teach you how to make a good CV. Because you want to attach that. If you're cold emailing, you want to attach that. Yeah. But as I said, in an ideal world, you would be able to speak to the person in person. Maybe they're at a talk in the department that you're in, and you want to work with them. Try to sidle up and, and say hi. Um, I mean, students, interestingly, I did myself, get very intimidated by professors, but professors are a nervous bunch. They don't might not outwardly appear that, but we're all kind of, not all, but a lot of us are anxiety ridden. So don't be shy of them because they're certainly shy of you. Yeah.
Wow, it's always interesting to hear about like the flip side from a student's perspective.
Mhm.
And I guess all the tips are really important and
Yeah.
really good to know. So thank you for sharing those.
Yeah.
And I
Hope
guess
it
if
helps.
from a professor's perspective, if
Mhm.
students just came and knocked on your office door to ask to talk about graduate school and whatnot,
Yeah.
that's always okay.
Yeah, it's always okay. And honestly, like if it's not okay and they're about to swear there, if they're rude to you, you probably don't want to work with them anyway. Going back to the whole litmus test thing,
Right. It's a very valid point.
right? Yeah.
And last question that we have on our list that is related to graduate school, but is a little bit more of like a broader scope, less so advice and more so, um, well, yeah, less so advice about getting into graduate school, but how can we ensure inclusivity and diversity in mental health research participants, or even in like mental health research overall?
Yeah. This is a great question, and this is something in the context of the bipolar disorder research that I and my colleagues do. We're very conscious of, and I think what researchers have to be very aware of is that the classic sort of paradigm of trying to have a representative sample is very problematic. A representative sample might capture a sample of the population that is representative of the, percentage of groups within that population, but representative does not mean it represents. That is, you might have one person who is transgender in a sample of 100 people, but then now you have deprivileged their opinions and insights. And so our approach is like, at least in the last 10 years, has been to you you deliberately sample populations, right? It's not always easy to gather that, like a representative sample of each potential subgroup of the people you want to study, but it's important, and it's hard work. It's certainly more work than just taking a random sample of undergraduate students in a psychology class. You have to work with the community in question. You have to pay them for their time, so it's also expensive, because they deserve to be paid for their time if they're going to be part of research. Yeah. I don't know if
Right.
that addresses your question at all.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it's, yeah, the difficulties of it, of course, there are inevitably difficulties, but is this like the way that we're seeing research progress, especially in your field of expertise now, like moving
In
forward?
mental health, it's becoming increasingly required that you have at least a minimum community advisory group that at least guides the research questioning, the research questions, and the research process. That's important. It is costly. As a researcher, you have to set aside funds and budget to pay these community advisory group members what their time is worth and what anyone's time is worth. And the Canadian Institutes for Health Research on their website, they tell you specifically what the minimum amount of money is you should be paying them for their time for a variety of different scenarios. So there's guidelines for this. There's guidelines for working with communities and making sure that they are compensated for their contributions, right? Yeah. So
Makes
I would say
sense.
it's increasingly things are moving in that direction. In fact, a lot of grants these days will ask, how are you engaging with the community that you plan to study? And you should have an answer to that, right? I think. Yeah.
It's pretty
Yeah.
good, I guess, progress in
Mhm.
this area in
Yeah.
terms of research for the
Yeah,
future.
I mean, patient representation, although I don't like using the word patient too much, or representation of people with lived experience within the team that is studying a phenomenon as well, not just a community advisory group, but having people who are part of the research team that live with a condition that you're studying is critical. They need to provide their personal insights. They are the experts, in my opinion. I'm no expert of many of the things I study. I am an expert of bipolar disorder because I live with it, but beyond that, I'm not much of an expert. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for, I guess, all the insights and all the advice. And I think that that's all the questions that we had, which is
Great.
great in terms of timing. But I'm not sure if, Stephen, you have anything else that you'd like to leave us off with, or anything else that you would like to share.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you for all the good questions, both to you, Melody, and also to anyone who submitted a question online for this talk. I appreciate that. Thank you.